From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. When I began my work creating the Optimism Institute, very quickly I was pleased to find that there were others out there taking on this same challenge, to let people know that despite our difficulties, there are many things going right in the world. One of the very first podcasts I discovered addresses that idea directly, both in its content and its very title. The What Could Go Right podcast is hosted by my guest today, and the product of an entity he founded called the Progress Network. Zach Karabell is not only the founder of the Progress Network, he's also the president of River Twice Capital and an accomplished author and columnist. Zach was educated at Columbia University, Oxford, and Harvard, where he received his PhD. He's also taught at universities including Harvard and Dartmouth, and has written widely on economics, investing, history, and international relations. His most recent book, Inside Money: Brown Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power, was published by Penguin Press in May of 2021. Zach is the author of 11 previous books, covering a wide range of subjects including Harry Truman's victory in the 1948 election, China and its economic relationship with the U.S., and the future of business in America. Zach is a regular columnist for Time and contributing editor for Politico. He's also written for Slate, Reuters, and The Atlantic, and is an occasional commentator on CNBC, Fox Business, and MSNBC. And in 2024, he relaunched his former column as a great weekly Substack newsletter with the terrific title, The Edgy Optimist. I hope you enjoy this blue sky conversation with Zach Karabell as much as I did. Zach Karabell, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you, Bill.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I've long admired your work, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that, especially some work you've done very recently. But I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about your background and how, at least on the surface, it might be a surprising path to the work you're doing with the Progress Network and the What Could Go Right podcast. So you've written and taught and worked, it seems, largely in the financial world and written about the history of finance and taught finance. What brought you to this subject of optimism, and why do you think there's that spark in you to do all this work and use your time this way?
Well, actually, I started out as an academic and got a PhD in American history and international relations, and then spent 4 or 5 years supporting myself as a writer, wrote a bunch of books, a couple about American history, one about the Middle East. I did a book about the building of the Suez Canal called Parting the Desert. And that book actually was it was a look at how East and West came together at a time. I wrote the book in 2001, where there was already a pretty profound sense of East and West, or in this case, the Western world and the Middle East being deeply at odds. And,
yes,
I was very interested in the way in which there had been periods of intense concord, not just periods of intense discord. I then wrote a book a bunch of years later. I sort of inadvertently ended up in finance and helping run some asset management firms. And I started a fund that invested in U.S. and Chinese companies that were keyed to China's economic growth post China joining the WTO in 2001. And that too, if you think about the theme of that fund, right, it was about companies that were benefiting from China's emergence as an economic force in the world, a positive, constructive thing, or at least it seemed so at the time. I mean, people are clearly second guessing that today, but I stand by the degree to which it certainly benefited hundreds of millions of Chinese, and in many ways, many people around the world in terms of lower cost goods. And look, more people around the world being more prosperous is just a good thing, full stop.
Right.
And then I wrote a book after 9/11, many years after 9/11, but sort of the assumption of this eternal war between Islam and Christianity or Islam and Jews. I wrote a book called Peace Be Upon You about Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence, which was an attempt to write a history of peace, basically saying there's been millennia of history. Most of history is about wars, right? Or about discord, because that's human. It's narrative, it's drama. Tolstoy once wrote, there are no novels about a happy family.
Yes.
Because every happy family is the same. So, human beings write stories of drama.
Yes.
Shakespeare, right? Comedies and tragedies. The only difference between a comedy and a tragedy is trick question. Not a trick question, just curious if you know.
I always just assume it's something in the ending, but you tell me.
And how do comedies usually end in a Shakespearean comedy?
They end pleasantly, I believe, and the tragedies, everyone dies.
Yes, everybody gets married. And then tragedy, everyone dies. But the arc before that is almost identical. They always begin with some static moment. Everyone's kind of in a good place.
Right.
Then something happens to completely disrupt it. And then in a comedy, everything comes together and ends well. In a tragedy, everybody dies. So, I mean, the point is, we don't write history of peace because, peace has none of the narrative arc.
Yeah, right.
But that's a problem because it gives us a sense of eternal conflict. Anyway, that's a long answer to say I've been dancing around more indirectly or elliptically these ideas of we're spending too much time focusing on everything that's fakaked and not nearly enough time focusing on the things that aren't. And I spent a lot of time after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, talking to investors. And for years and years and years, the question was essentially, when's the other shoe going to drop? When's it all going to fall apart more than it even already fell apart? The question was never, what are we missing on the upside? It was always, what are we not prepared for on the downside? Because downsides scare the bejesus out of people, and upsides scare people because they assume that everything's just too good to be true, and so there must be a bad thing happening. And I started a column in 2011, I think it was, for Reuters called the Edgy Optimist, to really focus some of that, which ran on the Atlantic and also eventually became a column for Slate. And then I stopped doing that, I think, in 2014. So I've been, dancing around this for a lot of years.
And so then at some point in that history, you start the Progress Network and the What Could Go Right podcast. And an interesting thing about the network, as you put it together, was it seems you looked for sort of kindred spirits out there in the world who are doing similar work. And I'm guessing you saw what I found is that while we're overwhelmed by the voice of negativity, there's a refreshing number of people on the other side of that. And some very articulate, brilliant people. A few have been on my podcast, now you, and also Steven Pinker. I'm about to interview Daniel Pink. There's a lot of people out there who have a very different point of view. And was that one of your hopes, to try to sort of amplify the message of this, brighter look at the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I started this in I think October of 2020, so right at the heart of COVID and at the heart of what was then a normally contentious election between Biden and Trump, and did so from the perspective of the darkest before the dawn motif, right? When people were essentially gripped by a panoply of negativities, a plethora of pessimism. Those were the times when you needed to really focus the mind on there's going to be another world out there. This too shall pass. And that's when I began the Progress Network. And as you say, brought together, it's now about 150 people who have very different agendas and very different, I think, sensibilities, except for the degree to which they're united by a sensibility of we need to spend more time focusing on what we can do to create the future that we hope for, and less time fearing the future we think we're ending up in. And all from the predicate of the future is uncertain. How we behave in the present is essentially the instrumental determinant of what that future is going to be. Like nothing's set in stone. And so how we behave, what we do, how we speak, how we write, the ideas that we seed and germinate have an impact on what that future is going to be. Not just, oh my God, it's going to be terrible, or oh my God, it's going to be great. Now, I will say that my notion of creating a network, the idea being, even if some of these people were extremely prominent, like Pinker, in the case of Daniel Pink or others, that they were all essentially atomized in a culture where news as we know it and public conversation as we know it is largely skewed to the negative. Again, some of that's back to what we talked about before. Human beings like narrative, they like drama, they like outrage. They respond liminally to hot emotions, not to cool emotions. So there is no, for years I struggled with the idea of like, can you stand on that proverbial soapbox on the corner and shout, everybody calm down, without being that Kevin Bacon character in Animal House and getting completely run over? So
Right.
I think the answer to that is largely no. You can't in real time compete with the relentless, intense pull of negativity, but you can over time. Now, final comment about the Progress Network in this respect: creating a network didn't really work. I mean, it worked optically. There's a bunch of people on the site. They all
Sure.
joined. Getting them to
Yes.
act as a network didn't work. And I think that's partly, I'm sure, my fault. I think it's partly the challenge of idea entrepreneurs are predisposed to view bandwidth as zero sum. So there's no
Hmm.
real working together per se. There's opportunistically
Right.
working together to promote a book or to, maybe get more attention in the moment. What worked a lot better than I thought was the podcast and the newsletter and the social
Yeah.
media stuff. And I didn't expect that kind of the media part of it to work so well. And I was struck. I went to
Yep.
this Progress conclave that Jason Crawford organized. That there are now all these movements, yours included.
Yeah.
Kind of like, I don't know if you've had this experience. Often, like if you're our class of people, class being educated urban, that's all I mean by that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you really want your kid to have a distinctive name. It's like a big thing amongst our cohort. Like, I want my child to
Yes.
have an original name. And you rack your brains and you come up with a name that you haven't really encountered a lot in your life today. And you're like, oh, this is cool. I really like this name.
Yeah.
And then you send your kid to kindergarten and there are like 5 other kids with that name.
Exactly. How'd that happen?
So, I thought the Progress Network was original and interesting and kind of carving out its own space. And then suddenly I realized that there's 12 other places that are doing it quietly. And that's
Right.
great. I mean, I'm really hopeful because of that there's this sort of in the air feeling of this stuff.
One of the many things I admire about Zach Karabell's work is that he goes after difficult and concerning subjects like the Middle East and China, but with a sense of hope and a healthy appreciation for historical context. I've not read his book, Peace Be Upon You, but I know I myself was surprised when I studied the history of Spain years ago and learned about the centuries-long peaceful and collaborative history between the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian inhabitants there. I also like the way he says that the future is uncertain, but that the way we behave today will impact that future. And lastly, a note of appreciation for Zach's dropping of one of my favorite Yiddish terms, fakakta. Feel free to look that one up if it's new to you. Now, back to my blue sky conversation with Zach Karabell. You mentioned the Edgy Optimist, and you said that you had put it on the shelf for a while. It is now back. So I'm curious to know, what was the motivating factor for you to say, the time's right to dust this off and get back to, it's a great title, and I'm glad it's not going to waste, and you're also writing great pieces, but how did you decide to bring it back?
So, like a lot of people, I've been writing for a lot of different places. Was a contributing editor for Politico. I did a column for Wired for a bunch of years. I did a column for Time for many years. I occasionally contributed to the Wall Street Journal, to the New York Times, the who's who of mainstream media. And the challenge there is, while there may be some virtue in the always be pitching motif,
Yes.
it's very tiring. And it's also true that, it's great to have a piece in the New York Times or the Washington Post, but increasingly, unless you're a named columnist there, and even then, the newer ones are few and far between. Most of these places are about aggregating content, interesting content.
Sure.
Bloomberg View now, I think, is doing incredible stuff, and Tim O'Brien's the editor there. I think is doing incredibly good stuff, really interesting, eclectic, not just knee jerk. But a lot of these places publish, I don't know, 200 pieces a week or 150 to 200 pieces a week. And it's great if you're that person for that day and your friends call. So if you're me and they see in the New York Times, like, hey, what's up?
Yeah.
And then it's done, right? The story has moved on.
Yep.
Substack is a really interesting, just like Medium was, and I suppose Patreon to some degree, but Substack clearly has captured a certain amount of what is it to do self-publishing? And I've reached a point where I am by no means like a household name. I'm sure no one who's listening to me now has heard me before, but I've built up enough of a small following that I could launch a Substack with a pretty decent list.
Yeah.
Because that mattered to me too. I'm not really that interested at this point in like, chipping away and adding 10
Yeah.
people a week. I think if I was younger or if I was different, I would absolutely do that. So I was able to launch with a list of about 24,000, 25,000 people. And I thought, well, if there are 25,000 people who are actually really interested in reading what I have to say, I should try doing that rather than spending all my energy pitching to other places. Doesn't mean I'm not going to write for other places. And it's in sync with the Progress Network. It's in sync with all this. So I just did it.
And it's I talk a lot on the show about these new technologies that we tend to take for granted, sometimes at our peril, I think, to our own mindset. Substack's a great example. I mean, the fact that you can start something with 25,000 people on a list, immediately write whatever you want, send that to them. I mean, it's just, you couldn't do that. And today, book publishing is such a challenging thing. I mean, the idea that you could crank out a book and quickly get 25,000 copies sold, it's not that easy to do anymore. Not that it ever really was, but so it's an incredible way to go straight to people, just like you and I are on this podcast and yours. That's the other thing, podcasting. I mean, my gosh. And this is a good segue to the election that we just went through. Looking at the many debriefs on this election and what happened and what went wrong or what went right, depending on your side. One of the things they've talked a lot about is Kamala Harris bypassing, Joe Rogan's podcast. Big mistake. If you said to someone 20 years ago, 15 years ago, one of the biggest mistakes of this election was they bypassed so-and-so's podcast, you'd be like, are you out of your mind? So, I mean, it's amazing these avenues we have now directly into people's ears. But speaking of the election, you and I are recording this interview less than a week. It's hard to believe. Seems like a month ago. Less than a week from the election, the re-election of Donald Trump. And you, the very next day, November 6th, you put out a Edgy Optimist, and the title was, well, that happened. I'm going to do a bad job probably of sort of paraphrasing your big idea, but let me give it a shot. Essentially, there are two things you said. One was that, yes, this is a bombastic, loud guy who, you could argue, has fomented violence and anger, but our country's always been like that. So it's kind of some would say it's cynical. I don't think it is, but it's a real realization that our country isn't as perfect as we all like to think it is, never has been. And you mentioned your past and history fueling a lot of your optimism, because I think a healthy sense of history helps you understand that today's times are not unprecedented. So that's one thing you said. And another was, let's focus less on what this person says and more on what his actions have been or will be. So I don't know if that's a fair paraphrasing, but could you tell me sort of what animated that column? Did you have it in mind in case he won? I mean, it was a really impressive piece that came out the very day after the election.
I mean, to some degree, what I wrote echoes things that I wrote in 2016, 2017, 2018. I did a piece for The Guardian in 2017 saying, pay attention to Trump's actions, not his words. I did a piece in 2020 during the pandemic, purposely provocative, but said, for Politico, if Trump says it, does that mean it's not true? And, to sort of focus people on, we've become so tribalized and so focused on how odious many people find the character of Trump, that you kind of lose sight with underlying policies that would have been true of a lot of Republicans, would have been true of a lot of people that a lot of people disagree with, but are not particular to the person.
Right.
And sometimes not even particular to Republicans. Meaning, I tried to point out in the piece, we're going to hear a lot about what's going to happen in terms of immigration and enforcement of undocumented people who are in the country, and whether or not there is, in fact, what is being labeled as mass deportation. And as is the case of the news, right? We live in the endless present. So it's as if nothing happened before.
Right.
And there were 12 million deportations from 1993 to 2000 when Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was president. There were 10 million deportations from 2001 to 2008 when George W. Bush was president. And there were another 5 million deportations, mostly between 2009 and 2013, meaning mostly in Obama's first term.
Right.
To the point where Obama was called the deporter-in-chief by many Hispanics.
Yes.
And, it strikes me that if you're going to become outraged at what Trump is proposing, then there should be or should have been commensurate outrage about what was done those previous times, which I think is perfectly consistent and perfectly fair. There's a real argument to be made that we're just wrong. There's a whole bunch of us that are just wrong about immigration, that we should allow for undocumented, that it actually, at the end of the day, strengthens us, that the hysteria around this is both generated and typical of a time when people feel economically insecure, even with the economy, quote unquote, doing well. We've had lots of anti-immigration periods in American history. But to act as if this is outrageous because the language that Trump and a whole bunch of people around him employ is notably more hateful. I mean, it just is. I don't even know that you could be a Trump supporter and claim that it's not notably more hateful.
Right.
But I also don't know that if you're that immigrant being deported by ICE, whether it particularly matters to you, whether it's being done by a smiling president or a snarling one, right? The outcome is no different. Being told paternalistically, this is for your own good.
Yeah, right.
Versus someone saying something really mean. I don't know that matters, right? And that is a case where words actually, I think, don't matter.
Right. Yeah, and I think, not necessarily devil's advocate, I think what happens, and I'm someone who feels this way, the language comes into it in terms of sizing up a candidate, in terms of what are we projecting to younger people? What are we projecting, from the highest office in this country to the rest of the world? That if someone who's maybe more of a, I don't know if you'd say Obama's a bureaucrat, but someone who's more doing this for different reasons or with a different style, at least portrays to the world that we have compassion, we care, and we're doing this for different reasons. Is that something that you think about or tempers your thoughts on how much language matters?
Would I prefer a world where people spoke respectfully, acted with dignity, treated those with whom they disagreed with a measure of human respect and acknowledgement that differences can exist even within a context of acknowledging other people's humanity? Would I prefer a world where people had the maturity to engage each other around their strong and deep disagreements with some degree of civility? Would I like it if people didn't say incredibly hateful, catty things about each other, either in public or behind their backs?
Right.
Whether that was in politics, in business, in school, in life. Yes, I would much prefer if humanity conducted itself in that fashion. And I certainly try in my own limited way in whatever I can do, both in modeling that to my own children, behaving that way with my friends and family, and in how I write. I strive for that, not always perfectly, of course. Sure. Yeah. Do I think it would be a better thing? Yes, I would think it would be a better thing. But I'm also deeply, deeply aggrieved at the idea that we should hold out for the ideal in a world of the real, that we should not acknowledge that our striving for an ideal is often just that.
Yes.
And that there's a pragmatism that has to infuse one's idealism. Part of the point of the Edgy Optimist, there was a lot of reasons to use the word edgy. I could have used a lot of other words.
Yes.
One was, it's not all, rose-tinted glasses. It's not all walking through a beautiful bed of gardenias. There's a lot of ugliness and nastiness in the world that you can acknowledge while being optimistic about the overall arc of humanity.
Yes.
And it was also to say that you can, in fact, look human ugliness in the face and hold that simultaneously with human beauty and constructiveness. You can hold destructiveness and constructiveness side by side as just part of the human experience.
Yes.
And that if you're going to be constructive and optimistic, you had better acknowledge the destructiveness. But if you're going to focus relentlessly on everything that's going wrong, it would behoove you to also look at the things that aren't. Like, both are true.
We'll get back to this episode of Blue Sky shortly, But I first wanted to remind you about a podcast I think many of our listeners will like. It's called Money for Couples. Hosted by Ramit Sethi, it helps couples create a shared financial vision with clear steps for saving, spending, and living your best life together. Money for Couples brings real actionable advice with stories from real couples who face the same financial challenges you might be dealing with. They also tackle money planning challenges like in episode 172 that's entitled, We Save for Retirement, but Have No Money to Spend Now. Since financial challenges are some of the thorniest that couples can face, we appreciate this podcast's ability to help people through them. Check out Money for Couples wherever you get your podcasts. Zach Karabell gives us a lot to think about here. And whether one is happy or not about the most recent presidential election, it probably is a healthy and helpful exercise to try to distinguish words from actions. Zach is clear that words matter, more on that later, and I agree that they absolutely do. But it may help us manage our spirits and outlook over these next 4 years by trying to distinguish between the two. Now, back to our conversation. In that column after the election, you wrote, the obsession with what Trump says has long clouded judgment. His words and instincts may suggest authoritarian inclinations, but the reality of 2017-2020 was that his administration behaved very much like any other mildly corrupt administration, and the policies that ensued may have been deeply objectionable to some, but were nonetheless lawful and democratic. We've had similar characters before, I think is the point you're making. And again, he comes wrapped in this package that makes it feel very different. But when you get down to brass tacks, it isn't as different. Is that a fair way to describe what you're trying to say?
Yes, it is. And now a lot of people have pushed back and will continue to push back. A lot of women, or myself included,
Sure,
who are staunch supporters of a woman's right to choose, push back and go, how the hell can you say that with the rollback of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, and just these really ugly restrictive policies in states like Texas that do in fact raise the possibility that a woman who's having a miscarriage will die rather than the doctors quote unquote aborting the fetus. So my response to that is, one, there has been a 25, 30-year grassroots Republican, largely Republican, not entirely, movement in the United States to roll back the protections in Roe v. Wade, to the point where before the Dobbs decision, there was one abortion clinic in Mississippi. There were like 2 in Alabama. Right. The restrictions were intense in Louisiana. There had been a very effective state-by-state rollback of a lot of these rights that was hanging by a thread. And you had a Republican grassroots movement to create a court movement, partly through the Federalist Society and others, to in fact achieve an aim of rolling back Roe, while the Democrats just relied almost entirely on the courts to protect a woman's right to choose. So you cannot say, oh my God, Trump did this. You could absolutely say the Republicans did this.
Right.
But if you're going to label, the one of two parties in the United States an authoritarian fascist party, you're going to have a really hard time convincing a lot of people of the intellectual honesty of that. Rolling back women's reproductive rights may be ugly. It may be morally wrong in your eyes. It may be the worst thing that's happened in the past few years. That doesn't make us a fascist authoritarian society. And if words matter at all, we should choose our words carefully. These are still being done democratically within a democratic system. They're not being done, because the military seized the hospital and arrested all the doctors. Like, there's a difference.
Right.
Words matter, and they suggest something. And a lot of people then go, well, what about January 6th and the attempt to subvert an election? First of all, as much as a lot of what happened between November 20 and January of 21, that was an attempt to subvert an election, there has been attempts to subvert elections, and there's been resolutions of elections in the United States non-democratically that did not lead to the end of the Republic. 1876, Tilden should have won. Hayes was put in. Reconstruction ended. It was a compromise done by elites in the face of a popular vote, contrary to the popular vote, contrary to the electoral vote. I don't know how you look at what happened in 2000 as anything other than a subverted election. I mean, the fact is, Gore would have won the election, right? If Florida had been able to do a recount, the Supreme Court just said, well, no.
Yeah.
Not only did they say no in 2020 in Bush v. Gore, they said, we're going to say no, but this shall have no precedential effect. One of the weirdest court decisions ever. Like, this is
Yes.
a no, but this has no other. Don't use this as a future
Yes.
something. We seem to survive that. I'm not saying I would have. I thought it would have been outrageous if Trump had somehow managed to stay in power. Would that have meant the end of democracy as we know it? I'm not so convinced about that. And whatever happened on January 6th, I mean, it was a riot. I don't know if it was an insurrection. It was shocking. It was unbelievable at the time. Trump was totally derelict in his presidential duty to protect the Congress. But, again, I don't want to get into this at any great depth. I am not convinced that even that represents what people fear it represented. And of course, we won't know, right? Because it ended the way it ended.
Yeah, and looking for silver linings from last week, we woke up the next day. We knew who'd been elected, where there wasn't violence. Let's knock on wood. We get between now and the next inauguration without it. I'm glad you mentioned Bush v. Gore, because another element of that year, which is scarily going on almost 25 years ago, because you have to remind younger people. But when people say, oh, gosh, we might not even know who won tomorrow or next week, that went on. That was close to Christmas, I think.
Yeah.
Before the Supreme Court. Wasn't it just late December?
That was one of the justifications for the Supreme Court decision.
Right.
They said there's a hard deadline here where the election has to be certified. And if Florida is allowed to go ahead with its recount or its actual redo, that deadline will be missed, and that will create constitutional crisis.
And 5 or 6 weeks without knowing who was going to replace Bill Clinton as president. Wild. So I want to read this quote to you that it was funny because it popped up in my feed the other day from someone in your network, Steven Pinker, we've already mentioned. But in Enlightenment Now, which is a book I really loved, he said something that I think relates to what we're saying. I'd love to get your reaction. I'm sure you've read it before, but might not remember it. He said, as we care more about humanity, we're apt to mistake the harms around us for signs of how low the world has sunk rather than how high our standards have risen. So there I think he's talking, in the wake of the Enlightenment, we have very different standards and higher standards than we used to. And so when these wrongs happen, we think, oh gosh, this world's going to hell, where actually it's stuff that years ago might have been totally acceptable, but our standards have risen. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, I mean, I've been mulling this idea, as I think many people have, that some of the discontent you're seeing globally.
Yes.
Because every government, by the way, in the wake of COVID, where there was inflation, other than Mexico, suffered a pretty significant electoral rebuke.
Yes.
This past year, whether it's the
worst year
Tory
for incumbents
party in
in
the UK,
history
whether
or
it's
something like that. Yeah.
Macron's, whether it's Modi in India. So you can look at the kind of roiling discontent, particularly amongst middle classes throughout the world, as a sign of rising populism and a turn away from democracy. You can also look at it in light of what you've just talked about, which is an expectation that governments deliver economically and socially what they are promising and do not self-enrich the people who are in them, as a form of rising expectations that is actually quite constructive, because it's when you become fatalistic about this is just the way it is and always shall be, that you can sink into kind of an apathy and are much easier to control as a result, as opposed to the roiling demand that your voice be heard and results be demonstrable. I'm not saying populism. I'm saying that rage or that outrage or that demand is reasonable or not potentially quite destructive.
Yes.
But it can be unreasonable and destructive. But the positive aspect of it is we are not satisfied with bread and circus. We're not satisfied with the way things have been. We believe not only things can be different, but they should be. And if you're not going to listen to our demands or at least meet them, we're going to try to find someone else that does. Now, you can go on and on about the irony of Trump is much more likely to be self-enriching than to enrich. And, much of that may be the case. But, there's many people who supported Trump who see him as an imperfect vehicle to perfectly legitimate ends. And I think that's a legitimate equation, meaning you don't get a lot of choices. Our system does not provide a spectrum of choices. It ultimately provides a couple of choices.
Yes.
That's probably not a good thing in a country of 330 million people, narrowing the range down to such. Nor is that, I think, a good thing that we have such a powerful executive branch as a thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Trump would hardly be an issue if people weren't worried about the power of the presidency.
Right.
One way to offset that, of course, would have just not to have had a president who was so powerful.
Right. Interesting. So we've talked a lot, given the timing, about the election and politics. Let's talk about some other things out in the world, because much of what you put out at the Progress Network online, on social media and in your podcast, is not about politics. So what are some of the other things that are going on in the world, in this country, globally, that gives you hope and optimism? From you'll write about things like healthcare and human rights. What are some of the things you look at and say, wow, I don't think people appreciate just what a positive path we're on in these areas?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do highlight weekly at the Progress Network, and that Emma Varvalukas, who's the executive director and has a small but dedicated staff who kind of scour the world for these interesting stories, is just the relentless march of healthcare benefits. I don't mean benefits like insurance. I mean mostly scientific and the healthcare breakthroughs that governments are then implementing, whether that's vaccines against malaria and tuberculosis and all sorts of tropical diseases that have been endemic in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of more jungle Latin America, and the degree to which you're seeing just the amelioration of this over and over and over again. The improved healthcare systems in countries that used to be really defenseless in the face of things, including Rwanda and its handling of the Marburg virus, something that would have been much more destabilizing 20 years ago, but is now being really managed well by these governments that have learned how to kind of deal with infectious and tropical diseases, highlighting the degree to which just, we in our desire to legitimately not to revisit the experience of COVID, forgetting the degree to which the development of the mRNA vaccine, unless you're Robert Kennedy, was an extraordinary scientific development done in a way that no one had thought possible, with a speed and effectiveness that no one had thought possible. And it's not like that's a one-off technology. That's a template for a whole series of other things.
Right.
So we try to highlight the ways in which these are being implemented in country after country after country. The human rights developments, recognition of same-sex marriage, more protections for women. You can certainly find countries where that's backslid.
Sure.
But you can find a lot more where the march is moving forward, not backwards. And just trying to show country by country, place by place, there's a lot of things that are happening where the funnel is opening outward in terms of prosperity, health, security, and even sort of daily security. So understandably, the world focuses on areas of conflict. Again, that's what news is about.
Right.
But most of the world is not Eastern Ukraine. Most of the world is not Israel, Gaza, Southern Lebanon, or Syria over the past years, or Sudan now. Most of the world is not that.
Right.
Those things are not going on. But they're not news because nothing's going on.
Exactly.
So you don't report on nothing going on. You report when something dramatically happens that changes the status quo.
Right.
You don't really report on the status quo. I mean, Morocco today is probably a pretty repressive government, but there's not even that many people left to repress. It's like it's economically stable. There's some degree of we've got this monarchy we always have. And within that framework, there's a lot of people whose, livelihoods are increasing, lifespan is increasing, security is increasing. But, that's not a story.
Right.
And if you're in the West, the story is, oh, look how repressive the monarchy is, right?
Right.
It's just a generic thing. So we just try to focus on there's a lot going on in the world that's actually quite good for the 8 billion souls on the planet. But a lot of that doesn't constitute the news.
Yeah, and I think focusing on those things that are good, it's not only makes you feel good, it informs your view of the future. So you made a reference to the COVID vaccine. And I'm very pleased when someone like you reminds us of what a miracle that was. I was involved with a healthcare board up in Maine when all this was happening, and we'd sit around. I'd finally think to myself, unless I'm missing something, until we have a vaccine, this isn't getting any better. And then I Google, how long does it take to do a vaccine? And 10 years, 20 years. It's like, how's this? It is an absolute miracle. And not stopping to appreciate that. Sadly, the vaccine became political. And again, we fell into our camps, pro-vax, anti-vax, all that. I think that's a dangerous development to not pause and appreciate. Jonas Salk became a household name after the polio vaccine. I know the name Moderna, but we didn't celebrate these incredible people who did this. And I think as we look forward and start questioning vaccines and that sort of thing, it can be a dangerous path not to take some time to appreciate these developments.
And look, to be fair to RFK, who I do think is quite conspiratorial, the infantilizing of information is a problem, was certainly a problem during COVID.
Yes.
To not be able to say to people, there's no such thing as a 100% safe vaccine.
Right.
There will be human beings who have negative reactions.
Yes.
But for the vast bulk of population and for the sake of the collective, these are infinitely better than nothing.
Right.
But infinitely better than nothing means that a few people will get screwed physically
right.
in terms of health.
Right.
And I don't know why that could not have been acknowledged.
Right.
I don't know why you couldn't have said, look, and part of that's an American problem more than it is other countries' problem, in that if the minute you say every life is sacred and we will do everything to preserve every life, you have a problem. Because while every life is sacred, there is no such thing as a collective that does everything to preserve every life without negatively impacting some other life.
Yes.
Like we just don't live in that world.
Right.
And to act like you do is a problem, because then it creates this dynamic that's deeply unhealthy.
Right.
So you should never have said the vaccines are 100% safe, because that's just a lie.
Right.
And it's always been a lie. I mean, Jonas said like that. No one pretended the polio vaccine wasn't going to kill a few people.
Right. Right. It was better than the alternative. And you also talked about
so much better than the alternative. It's like incomparably better than the alternative. But to pretend that it's 100% safe,
right,
is a problem.
At the risk of letting politics become too much a part of this podcast, I'd say that while I personally judge January 6th more harshly than Zach does, I do agree with him completely that with any such incident, it's helpful to put it into historical context and remember that we've survived similar challenges before. And it's helpful precisely because it gives us the very realistic hope that we can get through the difficulties that we face today. And frequent listeners to Blue Sky will know that I also greatly appreciate the remarkable development of the COVID vaccines and what Zach describes as the relentless march of healthcare improvements. And in all of this, you can probably hear in Zach's voice and see from his way of thinking why he calls his Substack the Edgy Optimist. Now to our final segment with the optimistic and edgy Zach Karabell. So Zach, as we look forward, what's next for you and the Progress Network and the Edgy Optimist? What are you hoping to accomplish now? We're again in an interesting time with re-electing a president who's quite controversial, and there's a lot of doom scrolling and doom saying out there. What's next for you, and how do you hope to make an impact these next few years?
So we live in a very noisy culture that's only going to get noisier. I'm under no illusions that adding to that noise will affect any more than a limited number of people who tune in to your own particular bandwidth, particularly in a world where people get to choose what they listen to. Mm-hmm. So Eli Pariser once, who's also a Progress Network member, coined that phrase of the filter bubble early in the sort of social media phenomenon, which has become far more true. We curate our own news. We look at what we want to look at. But I still think ideas matter, and you find the audience you find. And I do feel I'm in a privileged position that I get to find a somewhat larger audience. I'm not in Steven Pinker's position, meaning,
right.
I both acknowledge where I am and I'm fully aware of where I'm not.
Yes.
Often I feel like a AAA baseball player. Like I'm pretty good at what I do. I'm just not really in the big
Yeah.
leagues. And I'm going to keep trying to add that voice because I think ideas have resonance long beyond what you can see in real time. You never know if someone's going to read a piece or listen to a podcast and it's going to spark something that years later germinates into something else, along with all other series of things. And I think that's great. I think that's just the way the world changes and works. I do think there are a lot of people who are hungry for alternative perspectives on reality, largely because they intuitively know there are alternate perspectives on reality than the kind of ones that are heard. I think all these different channels are fascinating. And I do think what you and I grew up with in terms of the media and the mainstream media, I think increasingly, we might hold on to as a vestige, but it's just not as important. You began this with, if you look back at Kamala Harris's campaign, it conclude that one of the great mistakes was not going on Joe Rogan's podcast or not going on Barstool Sports or whatever the series of choices would have been. That's, I think, indicative of the world we're living in. That there are a lot of channels of influence. I do think, by the way, this is a complete back to another thing. The one thing that it remains hard to do is self-publish a book. You can self-publish a book and get it digitally. Yes. It's very hard to distribute a book. Much easier to do Substack or a podcast because the digital transmission is much easier. Still very hard to find an audience, by the way.
Sure.
Substack has millions of contributors, but very few. It's much more than 80-20. It's like 98-2 in terms of 2% get all the traffic. But even then, I think those ideas matter and people are able to express themselves and have like-minded people tune in to what they're saying. And that's great. I mean, YouTube, same thing. And so I'm just going to keep doing that because I think it's important, even though I recognize it's modestly important. It is one contribution amongst a myriad, and likely at any given time not particularly notable or noticeable. But I think the critical mass of all these other organizations, of what you're doing, of what's the Progress Conclaves, Abundance People, there's a whole series of organizations out there that I take great hope from, because I see them as, first of all, a lot of them are not very political. They don't cut in normal ways. There are a lot of people who are kind of in the progress studies world are very, they're more libertarian. They're more likely to be deregulatory because they see innovation as a necessary ingredient to solving human challenges, and the degree to which governments may be stymieing innovation can lead them in unexpected directions politically. I think all that's quite interesting. I think political realignments are important. I think static systems are a problem. So I hope that's an answer to the question. It's not like the most like, oh my God, I'm going to change the world this way answer. But it's my current plan. And look, I anticipate a lot of hysteria over the next years. Yes. I anticipate Trump creating a lot of chaos. I also think it's possible that there may be less hysteria and less chaos than we think, and there may be more hysteria and more chaos than we think. I think people are primed for maximum chaos, which if you're going to do the contrarian trade, if you're going to be in Wall Street terms, the contrarian trade would be not a lot of chaos.
Right. Time will tell. Well, Zach, I, for one, I'm really glad you've chosen to do this work. You're an incredibly talented person with a great mind, and there are a lot of different ways you could spend your time. I'm really pleased you're doing this work. I'm really thankful you came on the Blue Sky podcast, and I look forward to seeing what you do next as we enter these sure to be somewhat chaotic years ahead. So keep up the great work, and thanks again.
Thank you, Bill, and you too.
Zach calls out one of the aspects of social media that I think we should all be concerned about. The filter bubble allows us to curate our own news in a way that was never possible in the past. And while reading information that consistently reinforces our currently held views might make us feel good, in the long run, this practice is not good for us as individuals or all of us together as a society. And given Zach's intellect, impressive body of work, and sizable following, if he's in AAA, I'm playing high school ball on the junior varsity. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Zach Karabell. And if you did, please tell a friend, write us a review, and follow the Optimism Institute on social media. As we try to grow our audience, there's nothing better than word of mouth from our current listeners, so I thank you in advance. This and all of our Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing team at Sound On Studios. You can learn more about this great and talented group of people at soundonstudios.com. And all graphics and design for the Optimism Institute and the Blue Sky podcast are created by Crush Graphics. That's Crush with a K, and you can find their work and information at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.